Ambassador O'Sullivan, thank you for speaking to DW. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the European Union has imposed 14 packages of sanctions against Russia, covering 60% of its previous trade with the Russian Federation. And it seems like a lot. And still, we have to say, Moscow is able to continue its war on Ukraine, and its economy keeps growing. So you, as the European Union's special envoy for sanctions, are you disappointed about the impact those sanctions have had so far on Russia?
Well, I think, firstly, that we have to acknowledge the existential threat which the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine represented for the rest of the continent. This is really an epoch-changing moment, unfortunately, and this required the strongest possible response. Now, part of that is military assistance, part of that is macroeconomic assistance, part of that is political assistance, so, for example, accelerating the issue of possible membership of the European Union. But equally, it was clear from the very beginning that we were going to have to adopt very tough sanctions. Now, I don't think any of us believe that sanctions are a silver bullet or a magic potion which suddenly solves all problems. On the contrary, sanctions by definition are a bit leaky. They don't work perfectly. But I think the story for me is rather what we have managed to do rather than what we have not managed to do. The fact that we've adopted 14 packages with unanimity in the space of two years, covering, as you say, 60% of our trade and virtually all the most important aspects of our trade. We are almost stopped importing any kind of energy products from Russia. We are no longer exporting technology products or any important products for the Russian military-industrial complex. This is quite an achievement. If you'd asked us, I think, in a few months before the war, would we be able to do that? I think many people would have been very skeptical. So the good news is that, like anyone who deals with sanctions, I'm sometimes more conscious of the failings and the weaknesses than I am of the strengths. And of course, that's something we have to work constantly to repair.
So, but you're saying you are happy with what has been achieved so far, but do we just have to wait until those sanctions will bite? Well,
they are biting. I mean, to your point about the Russian economy, I'm an economist by training. If you look at the objective indices of the Russian economy, it's not performing well. The interest rates are currently 19%. Inflation is nearly at 10%. Nearly 30 to 40% of public expenditure in Russia is now going into military.
So it just needs time?
I think it takes time for the full impact of the sanctions to hit the Russian economy. But also, if you are willing to put your economy on a purely war footing and you prioritize above all else military production and military activity, of course you can cannibalize the rest of the economy for quite some time. Especially in a country where there is no democratic pressure, there's no democratic accountability. Ordinary people in Russia don't have a say in any of these decisions. Mr. Putin has drawn down nearly 50% of the National Welfare Fund, which was a kind of rainy day fund designed to protect the Russian people from the ups and downs of sudden changes. That money is being squandered on military. When will this, really impact the Russian economy? Views differ. Many people suspect that in the course of next year, probably in the second half, things are going to get tough. But, I repeat, these predictions are to be taken with a certain amount of caution. But on the other hand, the question we should ask ourselves is, what would have happened if we had not had sanctions? And the amount of money which would be available to Mr. Putin to fund this war. We estimate that roughly 400 billion euros less is available to Russia as a result of sanctions than would otherwise have been the case. That's a lot of money.
And you have just mentioned military production in Russia. And the big goal of the European Union was to try to make it harder for Moscow to continue its war. And European companies are not allowed to export certain goods that are crucial for Moscow's war effort to Russia. So how is Russia still able to obtain Western-made high-tech, for instance?
Well, I think there are two stories here. I mean, one is the fact that they are still able to get some of these products. The Russians have been evading sanctions since 2014. We must acknowledge that they're actually quite good at it. And therefore, they have put in place a very sophisticated systems of circumvention which enable them to continue to have access. We have been slowly shutting down these different channels, and we've been quite successful. We can see that from the countries which were originally platforms for circumvention, most of these countries are no longer exporting these goods to Russia.
Can you name those countries?
I can name them as Central Asia, the Caucasus, Turkey, Serbia, UAE. Exports of these militarily critical products from these countries to Russia have dried up considerably. Secondly, it has become a lot more expensive. Even though Russia is procuring them, they're paying in some cases somewhere between 150 and 300% more than they were paying before the war. So this is also impacting on their production. The other issue, of course, is that we're seeing that they are forced into collaboration with Iran and with North Korea in order to seek technology. So I think this shows that our sanctions are having an impact. But I repeat, sanctions are always leaky, and there will always be circumvention. The issue is not to eliminate it, it is to make it harder, to make it slower and less reliable, and to make it more expensive.
But at the moment, you are thinking about extending, for instance, the no re-export to Russia clause that would compel European companies to do even more to make sure that the components that they are producing either in the European Union or in third countries are not going to end up in Russia.
Well, precisely. As we have shut down the first phase of circumvention in the countries I mentioned, we have noticed that increasingly Russia is procuring through subsidiaries of European companies based in Southeast Asia. These companies are not exporting directly to Russia. There's no criticism of the companies here, but the fact is their products are finding their way to Russia, mainly through Hong Kong and China. That's why we wanted to alert the companies and why we at the European Commission would have liked to extend this no resale to Russia clause also to sales done by the subsidiaries of our companies in Southeast Asia. There were legitimate, I think, business and commercial concerns about that when we were discussing the last package. We're continuing to work on it, and I continue to hope that we will find a way forward in a future package.
And you mentioned China, which is of a big concern for Ukraine as well, because they are saying that a lot of those components are coming from China or being shipped through China. And the Ukrainians are saying the European Union needs to increase pressure on China. Is that a realistic proposal?
Well, I think we have been in constant discussion with China since the beginning of the war. And as you know, the Chinese have been very clear that from their perspective, they are not sending any military equipment to Russia.
But critical components.
Well, I was going to say, I think that is true in the strict letter of that word, but we do observe, indeed, that items which we would not traditionally think of as military, and this is mainly semiconductors, microchips, integrated circuits, flash memory cards, optical readers, things which would normally have a perfectly innocent civilian use. We know if they go to Russia, they're going straight into missiles, drones, and bombs. And we do observe, indeed, that China is now becoming an important source of these products. And this is something which has been raised at the highest level.
But it's for now more about talking, diplomacy, and you are not showing them yet the whole toolbox at your disposal.
Well, we have already listed some companies in China who are involved in this trade, and we have banned European companies from trading with them. That process will continue. We are also looking increasingly at the financial institutions who are funding these flows. And in the last package, the 14th package, for the first time, we equipped ourselves with a capacity potentially to sanction financial institutions whom we identify as funding these flows. this could lead to the correspondent banking rights of those institutions being cut off, which would be very heavy. The Americans have introduced a similar measure last December, and simply using the threat of using this has already got many banks in China de-risking and stopping business with Russia, because their business with the West is much more valuable to them. So I think we are seeing movement, and we continue to have means of pressure. But obviously it would be preferable if the Chinese authorities themselves would take steps.
Another problem that I wanted to talk to you about are oil exports. Still the biggest source of revenue for Russia. And the West has imposed a price cap for Russian oil. But now we see a large shadow fleet at work, old ships without proper insurance, smuggling Russian oil across the globe. How big is the problem, and what are you planning to do about that?
This is a major problem. I mean, I think it is important to remind your viewers that when we introduced sanctions, we in Europe stopped importing from Russia, but it was decided at the level of the G7 not to look for a full export ban on Russian oil and gas. This is something we could have thought about. We did it with Iran, for example, in order to stop the development of their nuclear weapon program. But we felt that it would be highly disruptive of international oil markets, and particularly potentially damaging for the global south and the developing countries who depend on Russian oil. So it is perfectly reasonable for Russian oil to be sold, to be bought, and to be transported. What we did do, as you say rightly, was introduce the oil price cap, which was to put a ceiling on the price which could be paid. And the way of controlling that was indeed, in particular, the insurance and the Western shipping companies who were traditionally transporting this oil. You're absolutely right. I think for many months this was effective, and we saw the revenue go down, and we saw a growing gap between the international price of oil, the Brent, and the price of Russian oil. The Russians have, as you say, now purchased many hundreds of out-of-date vessels, many of them in very poor condition, and they are using these vessels with insurance which is not at all clear, and they are shipping oil in these vessels around the world. It's a huge ecological risk. Everywhere I travel, when I raise this issue, many countries are very well aware that if one of these ships were to crash on the coast, it's not at all clear that there would even be real insurance there for the cleanup. So this is something on which we are working very closely with the level of the G7.
The UK, for instance, they decided to go after individual ships.
And which we are doing as well. We have already listed, I think, 20 or 30 vessels. We will continue to do so. Of course, the size of the fleet is measured in hundreds, not in tens. But we have an annex in the 14th package, which is specifically about targeting the vessels in the shadow fleet. And one of our current work streams is to identify as many of these vessels as possible. And I hope that in the next few months we will come forward, next few weeks, we may come forward with a proposal to list even more of these vessels. And we had a meeting a few days ago here in Brussels of the G7, and all our G7 allies are moving in the same direction. So you're absolutely right. This is a weakness in our system which we have to address. But I think we do have the tools to do that.
Ambassador O'Sullivan, thank you very much.
Thank you.